Kawartha Land Trust works and is located within Treaty 20 Mississauga territory. We are extremely grateful to First Nations for their care and teachings about our earth and our relationship to it. We strive to honor these teachings through our stewardship and respect for the land we protect, as well as continuing to build and maintain meaningful connections and relationships with Williams Treaties, First Nations, and other Indigenous peoples.
Welcome to Kawartha Land Trust Cation Wildlife Preserve. Today we're celebrating Black excellence in conservation here at the Cation Wildlife Preserve trails, which are over 600 acres donated by David and Sharon Cation, located just near Cobeconk, Ontario. Kawartha Land Trust is a land conservation-based charity working within the Kawarthas. We protect over 5,000 acres of natural and working lands, and that's in large part due to our volunteers, donors, and supporters. We're excited to welcome you here to our third annual Black History Month hike. It's part of our Passport to Nature series, which offers free events throughout the year with the goal of encouraging people to connect with nature. And we're really excited to be partnering with Diverse Nature Collective. As we walk through this beautiful wintry wonderland, we're going to reflect on Black excellence in conservation. And now I'd like to introduce Patricia Wilson, an incredibly passionate environmentalist and community connector and leader, and founder of the Diverse Nature Collective.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Oh, yeah. Great. This is a new great. And I said, and you never went? Yeah. Yes, that's right. So I said, I know what I offer, and you're not even worth it. So yes.
So something as serious as climate change and the effects, there have been a lot of studies that have been done to show that racialized community members are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change, right? They're more impacted. So racialized communities are more impacted by the effects of climate change. And yet we're not hearing from these voices, these communities who are more greatly impacted. And we are already seeing the effects of climate change. I mean, it's February and I'm not too layered up. We don't really have a lot of snow on the ground. So, you know, we're seeing some of these really adverse effects. Something that I found really eye-opening for myself was that over the last few years, I had to do a lot of unlearning and a lot of learning, and a lot of individuals who I've met, who I've worked with, you know, a lot of people who I've connected with haven't been mentioned in the textbooks, you know, haven't been mentioned in school. I went to school for conservation biology. I went to college for ecosystem management, and I never heard about, you know, Black contributions, really. I actually really don't ever hear about, you know, Indigenous or racialized folks' a contribution to the sector. When you think about the environmental movement as it is right now, you know, climate heroes or people that really stand out to you as champions who talk a lot about our environment, who are trying to protect it, who do you think? Like, what are some names that come to mind? Sorry, who? David Suzuki, yep.
Christina Figueres.
Okay, okay. Anyone else?
Greta.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Greta. Perfect. Yes, yes, okay. But oftentimes it's kind of a bit of a struggle for folks to come up with names. And so why do you think that might be? Why do you think it might be hard for some of you to recall some names, some racialized folk?
And for so long, white male dominated.
Absolutely. So for so long, it's been white male dominated. For so long, you didn't see that representation. Thinking there might be a smaller ratio of racialized folks, perhaps. Interesting thought. Yeah. Absolutely. So accomplishments not being credited to folks and just not being mentioned at all. So something that I always find really interesting, you know, when we talk about the environmental movement today, it is very white facing. You mentioned, oh, maybe there's more white folks than there are racialized folks within it, or Black folks, right? So yeah, it is very dominated by white voices, and it's also dominated by a more westernized lens, right? But I do want to segue into kind of the roots of environmental movement that folks might not know about. So around the civil rights movement is when the environmental movement really kicked off. And it was because racialized folks, in particular Black people, were protesting for their rights to not have toxic waste sites put in their communities, right? They were fighting a lot of injustices, both like racially, but also racial discrimination, but also environmentally as well. So someone who comes to mind and is regarded as the father of environmental justice is Dr. Robert Bullard. He's been working in the field since 1978. He's written over 18 books and publications, and he was one of the planners for the first National Association for Colored People Leadership Summits, which happened in 1991, where they actually developed the organizing principles of modern day environmental justice. So that's pretty huge contribution and something that not a lot of people know about or talk about. Similar to him, the mother of environmental justice is Hazel Johnson, and she was dedicated to researching environmental issues within her own community, Alt Gardens in the States, and connecting industrial pollutants in the air, in the waters, and on the landscape to the negative health impacts that were happening in her community. And so she did a lot of advocacy work to hold these companies accountable for the toxic waste that was dumped in her communities and the detrimental health effects that were happening in her community. And she educated her community, helped them to name what was happening and why there were so many high rates of cancer and other illnesses happening within her community. And so she had done a ton of work in that. And then probably one of my favorite folks is Dr. Benjamin Chavez, and he actually coined the term environmental racism. Has anyone here heard of the term environmental racism? Perfect. Can anyone give me some examples of environmental racism that they might know of?
I think you mentioned it earlier about how like toxic is like a fact.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So examples in Canada, a lot of people will think when you think of environmental racism, we think of the lack of clean drinking water in First Nation communities, right? That's environmental racism 100%. Right? So those are examples. But to tell you what that term is, it's defined as racial discrimination, specifically in environmental policies and the unequal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. It's racial discrimination and environmental policymaking and enforcement of regulations and laws that deliberately target communities of color for toxic waste facilities, like Danielle had mentioned. It's the official sanctioning of the presence of life-threatening poisons and pollutants in communities of color, and then also the history of excluding people of color from leadership in the environmental movement, right? So these voices aren't even heard at the decision-making table, and that's something that we still see today, right? So this term, was coined back in 1987, and this term is still relevant today because this stuff still exists today. And it still happens today of kind of pushing racialized communities to an area that's not that great to live in, or they make it, it might be a thriving community, but because the government or the townships or whatever, they start putting less and less funding to maintain things like roads and whatever. And they're essentially creating a ghetto system is what they call it, ghettoizing an area. And then in areas where white folks are living this is where they were able to have public parks, public pools, right? And so we saw that a lot during the civil rights movement and stuff like that as well, right? Before emancipation and afterwards. But we're still seeing that in other ways today as well. Like Athena mentioned as well, a form of redlining, in Canada would be the reservation system, right? So pushing Indigenous communities off of their land that was stolen, but also pushing them into reserves. And there's a lot of issues facing Indigenous communities, even working in conservation, talking with Indigenous communities, the lack of access to land to connect with nature, connect back to their language, connect with traditional foraging and hunting practices, right? And so all of that is connected. I'm gonna leave it there, and we're gonna go for a little bit more of a hike, and we'll continue chatting. Very slow. Very slow. Any questions? The mic's not on, so you don't have to feel any type of way. I want to talk a little bit about the history of no trespassing signs, because I don't think a lot of people know of the history of no trespassing signs. Does anyone like raise your hand if you do know about the?
I listened to you on TV.
No trespassing signs started in 1865, and this was just after the end of slavery in the United States. And no trespassing laws were part of black codes. Has anyone heard what black codes are? Talk about Jim Crow laws. Okay, yeah. So black codes are basically a restrictive set of laws that were designed to limit the freedom of formerly enslaved black folks and ensure their availability for cheap labor, right? Because there are still plantations and farms and things like that to be worked, and they wanted cheap labor. These codes limited the jobs, even the types of jobs that black folks were allowed to have, right? And their ability to leave those jobs once they had them, right? Which I think is a really interesting point to know. To cut costs, almost all slave owners had assigned each of their enslaved families garden plots or things like that to supplement their diet, because they weren't feeding them much food, right? So that they weren't feeding them. They were giving them rations of cornmeal and fatback, right? And so most plantations still had areas that were uncleared, that had forested areas. So a lot of enslaved folks foraged the land. They ate off the land. They grew crops. They were able to fish, hunt, things like that to supplement their diet, and they would even trade with other folks, right? So it was like the early stages of black folks, creating their own economy. So some of the garden produce and wild foods were sold door to door to white households in town, and along with handcrafted baskets. So, black folks were finding ways to survive and make a living as well. So after emancipation, many black people had the skills to be able to feed themselves, right? They knew how to garden, they knew how to work the land here, they knew where to forage, they knew all these things. They had that knowledge of the land and the landscape from living and working on those lands, right? And so to limit that, because they wanted to continue to have cheap labor, they developed trespassing signs, no trespassing. So now folks, formerly enslaved folks, when the countryside was open, they could forage wherever. They were very limited, right? So it was illegal for them to trespass on these areas where they once foraged, fished, things like that. And so it made it really difficult for them to be able to, fend for themselves, to be able to produce their own food. There was also a lot of laws that limited black folks in actually owning land, right? So land ownership was not a thing for black people. And it really did force folks to have to do what we call indentured servitude. So I think that's an interesting history, because in conservation today we use no trespassing signs to keep people off, but the history and those roots there, right, are really significant, and something that we should talk about. And then in terms of when we talk about segregation, in 1945, a mandate was issued to desegregate national parks. So that's still pretty late, right? Still pretty recent, sorry. Pardon?
Is that Canada or US?
That was the US, and we had some segregated parks as well, desegregated a little bit earlier, but it was mandated in 1945, but most states, national parks, they continued to enforce segregation anyway, right? So it was mandated, but people were like, I'm not gonna listen to this, right? They prohibited anyone who was non-white from entering up until the Civil Rights Act, right? So it was a mandate to desegregate. Most parks, national parks, didn't do that until 1964, because they had to with the Civil Rights Movement. The times had shifted, the times are changing. They had to it was officially declared illegal so they had to desegregate, right? But that was 1964. And so I think that's really interesting because the experience of Black folks on the land, has always been questioned and controlled, right? Their experience on the land to be able to connect with nature, to be able to forage, to be able to recreate has always been controlled, and as recently as 1964. But we know from earlier when talking about some of these environmental champions who were doing a lot of advocacy, activism work in their communities, that environmental racism was happening. These communities, we're still being affected by the effects of racism and environmental racism, right? So their connection with the land was still severed, right? Because the land that they were living on, you couldn't drink the water. The land that they were living on was poisoning them, literally killing them, causing high rates of cancer. Okay, so there is a really difficult history, and I think that people need to understand that this connection with the land, there is a really heavy history with that. The murder of George Floyd really started this movement again of Black people being unfairly policed, being unfairly accosted or questioned when they're out in nature. And so we've seen a lot of advocacy around that now because of these examples really highlighting Black individuals being over-policed, right? And being questioned all the time. And so something that was happening a lot during the pandemic, I'm sure all of you as well, we were like bored out of our minds. We're at home, we're stuck, we're isolated, we're scared. We wanted to go outside in nature. So the parks were packed. I don't know, did anyone go to an Ontario park or a provincial park? Yeah, over COVID, it was packed. There was a lot of people. And the park saw a lot of new users to the park, which is really great. We want people to connect with nature and get excited about it. But there was also a lot of issues of over-policing, specifically of Black and other racialized people well-being within these parks, right? By the staff, by security, by other members there questioning why are you here, or telling them they're not wearing the proper footwear, or they're not recreating in the way that maybe they recreate, right? So questioning. And so we do experience that a lot out in nature. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers that Black folks face or other racialized folks face when trying to recreate and connect with nature. It's why I do the work that I do, because I want to create safe spaces for folks to come together to be able to connect with nature and not feel like they're going to be unsafe or if they're going to be harmed.
Devastate the landscape. And so I always felt,
You're watching Celebrating Black Excellence in Conservation. We'll be back after a short break to continue our walk on the Cation Wildlife Preserve trails. Watching Celebrating Black Excellence in Conservation. We're back again. We're going to catch up with Patricia to see what she's seeing, hear the stories that she's sharing with us. So let's get going on the trails.
This upper plateau here, which is not uncommon.
And I do also want to mention a story that I had found out recently, that Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife actually were looking to visit Canada, looking to go to the the Bay of Fundy National Park. And so they were meeting up with two friends, and those friends were white, and they had written to a private inn that was situated just outside of the park to let them know, hey, we're coming. And, these friends, good allies that they were like, hey, just letting you know also, two of our guests, you know, are Black folks, and we just wanted to let you know, and all that, they'll be coming. And this innkeeper wrote back and essentially said, don't bring them, you know, and had said, like, the park wasn't segregated, but they mentioned that they get a lot of American tourists, a lot of people from the South there, and they just didn't want to upset the tourists there. They didn't want to allow for them. They sent them names of other places to go stay. They didn't want them, they weren't welcome to stay, right? They didn't end up coming. So they didn't end up coming because of the reception, because they also knew that coming here, even if they stayed somewhere else, perhaps they would be met with animosity in the park, right? Perhaps there could be some negative interactions. And negative interactions in national parks happen today still. It looks like it's so exposed right now because there's no like foliage, right? But like this guy is so hidden back here. What do we got? How many total?
You guys count?
11?
I overshot.
No.
Wow.
Very close. You were very. I was way off.
Wow, I was like maybe 6?
That's what I said. I was like,
So that's quite a huge tree. Wow, good job. I deliberately spoke a lot about American perspectives on when it comes to the environmental movement, when it comes to the civil rights activists and environmental racism, but it's something that is not really talked a lot about in Canada. Do you know why that actually might be? That's right. Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah, this is safety. We were the refuge here, but we actually also actively participated in the slave trade, right? So that existed in Canada. That is something that happened for before we became that area where, you know, folks were fleeing to. We actively participated, and even after the abolishment of slavery, you know, through indentured servitude, we also perpetuated that here in Canada. But I think it was very revolutionary, a really huge and fundamental project that Dr. Ingrid Waldron did, because we were actually able to map out and see it, you know, here in Canada. And it still shocks people to this day, and still a lot of people don't know about the first Black settlement in Nova Scotia. They don't know about Dr. Ingrid Waldron or that project, but she went on to found a couple of different nonprofits, one of which was helping rural communities being able to test water, their own water, because they can't trust the government to test their water. The government's like, oh yeah, we tested it, it's fine. You know, so having people being able to access the tools to test their water in an affordable way so that they can actually prove, yeah, no, my water is contaminated. Okay, welcome to the wetland. This is arguably one of my favorite spots, other than the tree. I showed you my 2 favorite spots. That one's a little bit more sneaky, so you guys got a nice little sneak peek. But yeah, this wetland, one of my favorite places. Yeah, the ice is kind of solid. Yeah, this is one of my favorite places on this property. Honestly, it's so beautiful. When talking about what route were we going to take, I said we got to at least see the wetland, but I wasn't about to make you guys go up that hill. So don't worry, we're not going any farther. We're going to turn it around. I want to acknowledge that while I do try to push for diversity in the outdoors, and I've talked to you about the importance of diverse representation, I do also want to pay tribute and make sure that we are honoring people who came before me doing this work, because it is really important. There is a lot of us, like I said, doing amazing work, and without the folks who came before me, I wouldn't be able to be doing it in the ways that I am. And so has anyone here heard of Brown Girl Outdoor Worlds or Color the Trails? I see some head nods, which is great. So yes, so Judith Kasiyama is the founder of Color the Trails, which is like a national business. It's across Canada. She's got chapters it started in BC, and there's also an Ontario chapter as well, and there's other chapters across Canada. And so Judith is the founder of Color the Trails. Demisha Dennis is the founder of Brown Girl Outdoor World, which is based in Toronto. Both of them work extremely hard, have shattered a ton of glass ceilings over the last several years to redefine diversity in the outdoors and what it means to truly have proper representation of Black folks and people of color in this industry. They have challenged outdoor brands on social media and held them accountable. They only work, and they work exclusively with brands who are doing the work or trying to do the work to diversify the outdoors, to have proper representation in the outdoors, and aren't doing it in a tokenizing way, right? One of the biggest things that I encourage you to do when you think, okay, what can I do to contribute to Black voices or racialized voices being heard, being seen, is supporting these pages. Follow us on social media, amplify these pages, and diversify your newsfeed. This is one of the biggest pieces of advice I give people. If you don't see it, you don't know it exists, right? And when we talk about the environmental industry in particular, we often do not see folks that represent, you know, all of Canada, right? Represent racialized folks and diversity. And so I encourage you, whether it's if you're passionate about the environment, you're passionate about fishing, you're passionate about books, or you're passionate about, like, you know, you have soccer or whatever hobby you have, find those diverse pages within those hobbies and follow them and amplify those pages. You can share their stuff, diversify your newsfeed, because once you start seeing that content, you're going to start getting more of that content, right? My TikTok is like pretty curated to my taste. I love reading, so I have I'm on Black TikTok, Black Book Talk, so I get a lot of that content. So once you start, you can train the algorithm so you can start seeing that, right? I mean, like, it's totally fair to say, oh, I don't know of these people, or I haven't heard of them. And we talked about why maybe that may have happened, right? And why we don't see more folks in the outdoors. We're not seeing it represented. We know the media is skewed. We know that when you go out to go buy camping equipment, you're not seeing diverse folks represented in the catalogs, in the signage, in commercials, television, things like that, right? So it all shapes our perception and our biases too, right? And the way that we see the world. But when you start going against that, start trying to find these folks and diversifying your feed, I'm telling you, you're gonna see, and you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, there are so many people that exist doing amazing work. And I'm so excited that I follow them, because I get to hear firsthand what are some of the issues, what are some of the accomplishments, and what are some of the amazing work that these people in our community are doing.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Great. This is a new great. It truly does mean a lot to be surrounded by community and to be celebrating Black History Month with y'all. So thank you. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you for joining us on this hike at Kawartha Land Trust Cation Wildlife Preserve. A big thank you to Patricia Wilson, the founder of Diverse Nature Collective. If you'd like to learn more about her organization and what she does, you can find her at diversenaturecollective.com. To learn more about Kawartha Land Trust and how you can help to protect and conserve natural and working lands in the Kawarthas, visit our website at kawarthalandtrust.org. You can find out lots more information about our public access trails. We encourage you to get out there, connect with nature, and above all else, continue to learn.